So thank you everybody so much for coming. My name is Andy Stavash. I am president of Harvard Law School Effective Altruism, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce today's guest, Cullen O'Keefe, who graduated from this very law school in 2019. He is a lawyer and a policy researcher interested in improving the governance of artificial intelligence using the principles of effective altruism. He currently works as a research scientist in policy at OpenAI and is a research affiliate with the Center for the Governance of AI at the Future of Humanity Institute, founding advisor and research affiliate at the Legal Priorities Project, and a VP at the O'Keefe Family Foundation. I can also say he is a terrific thought leader and someone who has definitely inspired me to get more involved in the effective altruism community on a personal level. So I'm extremely grateful that he accepted our invitation and is here to impart some of his thoughts today. So I'll turn it over to Cullen O'Keefe. Thank you so much.
Thanks for such a kind introduction, Andy. I'm super excited to be here and to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities I see that are very exciting for lawyers to use their law degrees to do more good with their careers. So as I mentioned to people who were here a little bit earlier, I put the link to this presentation in the bottom right-hand corner. It's also in the chat in case you want to see some of the slides for longer than I have them on screen. And also for most of the slides, there's notes with a URL to some references or further readings on the subject. Great. So as I mentioned, the topic of this presentation is really thinking kind of more creatively about what lawyers can do with a law degree to improve the world. And one of the key concepts of effective altruism for people that are less familiar with it is the idea of cause prioritization. Basically, the idea that different ways of doing good, different avenues for improving the world can vary quite dramatically in how effective they are based on discernible or at least somewhat discernible characteristics. And so I'm not going to get into a full argument for cause prioritization now, although in the Q&A, if you are interested in why effective altruists tend to think of some of the priorities I mentioned here as important, I'm super happy to do that. I imagine that there will be pretty ample time for Q&A at the end. Just to motivate this a little bit more, this graph is from a kind of foundational paper in effective altruism called the moral, I forget the exact title, but it's something like the moral imperative of cost effectiveness in global health. And it shows basically 5 different ways that one might go about helping people with HIV or preventing HIV. And it shows that the cost effectiveness measured in disability adjusted life years per $1,000 varies by orders of magnitude between these. So surgical treatment for Kaposi sarcoma, which if people don't know is a common condition brought on by HIV/AIDS, is very cost ineffective compared to education and condom distribution, for example. And again, the idea that this leads to an effective altruism is that we ought to find those things that are more like education for high-risk groups and condom distribution in the sense that they're much more cost effective per dollar or per hour worked, just because we have limited resources, limited time, and only one career, unfortunately. So again, within effective altruism, people have over time clustered towards kind of 3 or 4 different priority areas. And I'm going to kind of take that canonical division between the 3 or 4 top cause areas that effective altruists tend to focus on and highlight some ways that I think lawyers are really well positioned to improve the world dramatically. So the first and probably the one that people most associated with effective altruism is ending global poverty or ameliorating global poverty. This graph just shows the number of people living in extreme poverty, both today and projections into 2030. So as you can see, there's been dramatic reductions over the past 40 years or something. And unfortunately, going forward, that's set to plateau a bit. Extreme poverty, if you're wondering, is measured, as you can see at the top here, at $1.90 per day purchase power parity adjusted. So at first glance, this might not seem like a problem that lawyers are really well positioned to help with, but I think there are actually a ton of opportunities for lawyers to get involved. They're just perhaps a little less a little less well understood, or at least well publicized within the ways that law students typically think of doing good. So the first is just to research how to improve governance in the developing world. So there are some staggering statistics out there about the costs of corruption, the costs of poor governance, and its maleffects in the developing world. And obviously, this is a problem that lawyers are super well positioned to help with. I've linked here to some research from JPAL, which is the Jameel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And Professor Greiner of HLS is heavily involved in that. And they do empirical research around the world on methods for improving poverty, and they have a ton of research on ways that law and governance changes can improve outcomes in the developing world. And so if you have a social science background, especially, and are also interested in public law and things like preventing corruption or improving access to law, preventing injustice in the developing world, I think this is potentially a super interesting opportunity. The next that I think often goes underappreciated, even by immigration advocates, is just the amazing poverty amelioration potential of immigration. And what these graphs are basically trying to convey is that the same person immigrating from a low-income country to a developed country like the United States can earn just orders of magnitude more in the wealthier country just due to enhanced productivity. And lawyers are very well positioned to, again, help think through changes to immigration law, liberalization of immigration law, and how that can be made better for people wishing to make a better life in the developed world. And also, obviously, including sending money back to people still in the developing world, which is a huge source of income. Okay, another big cause area that people in effective altruism are interested in, I know Andy works on this somewhat, is the welfare of animals. So to motivate this a little bit, there are orders of magnitude, again, more animals in the world than us. Even if you're only including farmed animals, in the United States alone, there are more farmed animals than there are people in the world. And worldwide, the number of animals is in the, including wild animals, is thousands of times greater than people. So if we are interested in improving the welfare of sentient beings, it seems like a promising place to look. Obviously, most of the work done in this area has been focused on farmed animals. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is impact litigation in this area, which is a pretty well-developed area. And I've linked here to a talk. I obviously won't show it now, but I definitely encourage people to go look at this. This is a talk from our colleague, Jay Schuster, someone that Andy actually introduced to me, and I think does really, really cool work. And what he does basically is consumer protection litigation to make improved animal welfare standards. And the basic paradigm of this, which I think is extremely creative and the type of thing that I would love to see more of from both lawyers and the effective altruism community, is companies like to make claims about how their animals are treated, but these claims are often very misleading, and they're misleading in ways that you can find very easily through discovery, but also through just like public record of typical practices in the animal industry. And so when companies say things like our animals are treated humanely, but their practices are things that most consumers would not regard as humane, there's often a consumer protection case to be made. And so if you're interested in finding out this work, again, I linked to a talk that Jay did earlier this year. And I think that this model is potentially scalable. And so I would definitely encourage you to think about whether that's an approach that makes sense for you. And obviously there are other avenues for impact litigation for animal welfare as well, including through more traditional animal protection laws, although those tend not to be as robust as we would like, especially for farmed animals that make up the majority of animals in kind of human domain. A second one, which I'm really excited about, and I know there's a lot of buzz about, especially around Harvard and Boston, is alternatives to animal products, especially in food. So the Good Food Institute is kind of the leading industry advocate here. People have probably heard of things like Beyond Meat and Impossible Meat. And these technologies are becoming more and more impressive and more similar to the things that they aim to displace. And this area is one in which law is heavily implicated through things like the like FDA regulations and again, consumer protection law. And so lawyers will have a big role to play in making sure that regulations and laws, both at the national and state level, are amenable to getting these products to market so that they can displace similar products that entail animal suffering. And then I've included some more speculative ones as well that I think enterprising law students who want to take a very bold bet on improving the world could do. So one is improving environmental law for animals. And just to motivate this a little bit, I think right now, environmental law often looks at species and ecosystems as the primary entities deserving of protection. But from a utilitarian and kind of sentientist perspective, what really matters are individual animals and their welfare. And so thinking about whether environmental law ought to be changed so that it places a greater emphasis on the welfare of animals as individuals, as opposed to just thinking of them as species that either are endangered and therefore need protection, or not endangered and therefore deserve basically no protection, could be a really cool way to reform the law and improve the welfare of animals. Additionally, there's a history in the legal community primarily focused on this organization called the Non-Human Rights Project, again, which I've linked in the notes to this presentation, of advocating for animals to be treated as legal persons, at least certain animals, primarily kind of higher order animals like other primates, and elephants, dolphins, things like that, things with pretty advanced cognition. And I think that, again, this is a more speculative area, but in the future, we may want this to be one of the ways that we protect animal welfare. And so law students could think about whether through legal scholarship or through their own careers, this makes sense for them. Okay, and then the kind of final big cluster of cause areas that effective altruists tend to focus on is protecting the interests of future generations. To motivate this a little bit, it seems like most of the people that we can affect will be people who are not yet born, right? Climate change is obviously a huge example of this. There are probably others as well. And if we think that their interests are worth protecting at least somewhat, it seems that we have a pretty strong case for looking out for their interests. And because of the political and economic incentives that people face, their interests are often under-regarded. So one, and the area that I work on the most, is regulating potentially catastrophic technologies. So as Andy mentioned, I work in the governance of artificial intelligence and how to ensure that it's safe and beneficial, both now and in the long run. And technologies like biotechnology, obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic, and we in some ways got very lucky with this pandemic in the sense that the fatality rate for COVID is quite low, but there's no reason that higher rates are not possible. And indeed, with advances in technologies like CRISPR and some other kind of synthetic biology things, there's reason to worry that either accidental or purposeful more dangerous pandemics could lie in the future. And so thinking about how to regulate biotechnology so that that doesn't happen and we can still reap the enormous benefits of biotechnology is important. Similarly, obviously, nuclear weapons unfortunately continue to pose a risk to humanity, and lawyers are obviously quite involved in the process of regulating nuclear materials and negotiating arms control agreements and things like that. And so that's another extremely important area in which lawyers could be involved that I would be excited to see more lawyers go into. Another one is thinking about this problem from the top down, and so how to make governments more long-termist, meaning more wise in considering the long-term impacts of policies that they adopt today. Again, if we had a properly long-termist government, I think we would have been much better prepared for COVID. One of the things that President Trump did in taking office was defund, or I guess like lower the resources allocated towards pandemic preparedness. And from his perspective, it made perfect sense to do that. It's unlikely ex ante that there will be a pandemic in any one administration, and so the benefits of returning taxpayer dollars to taxpayers politically would seem to outweigh the costs. And obviously, President Trump got unlucky, and America got unlucky. But making government more systematically long-term regarding seems like an important area. It's kind of obviously a little bit less clear what that means, but I think that there are probably things that we could do to make this so, and lawyers are very well positioned to do that. Again, either through legal scholarship, thinking about things like the way that cost-benefit analysis is implemented in the government, things like bespoke institutions for future generations, but also going into government and helping advocate for the long-term regard for the long-term impacts of policies and actions that we take. Another one that again is probably more speculative is governing the resources in outer space. So obviously most of the stuff in the universe is in outer space. Well, we're probably not going to colonize space anytime soon. I think it's also a bit naive to think that we'll remain on Earth forever, although it might be the case that makes sense. And thinking about how we can best use the resources in outer space to improve human welfare seems pretty important. And again, an area that lawyers will probably have a heavy role in shaping. So that's just a taste of some of the kind of top cost areas that I think are super promising for lawyers. I have included some other ones in here, though, that I think could be very promising as well. Things like, obviously, global warming is an enormous issue that we still haven't solved. It's one that more people go into. So a key idea in effective altruism is that the more people are already working on a cause area, the kind of less promising additional people going to work in that cause area are. But still, I think that the world as a whole undervalues the threats from global warming, especially extreme tail risks posed by things like upwards of like 5 degrees Celsius warming. Reforming charity law so that charities incentives are more aligned with effectiveness rather than some of the incentives that they currently face could be potentially impactful. Human rights around the world, obviously extremely important. Mass incarceration, the millions of people who live in very poor conditions, especially in the United States, in incarceration. Preserving democracy and voting for the long term and helping expand democracy seems very important. Regulation and potentially promotion of human enhancement. So things like, biotechnology and its use on humans to beyond cure disease, potentially improve our capabilities and functioning. Obviously, that has a ton of very thorny ethical issues associated with it that lawyers will probably be heavily involved in regulating or directing. And then things like risk from widespread surveillance or potentially global totalitarianism could be very important as well to make sure that we maintain a free society on a global level. I just wanted to give a quick plug for something that Andy mentioned, which is the Legal Priorities Project. You can find us at legalpriorities.org. So this is an organization that I helped start up with another HLSJD and a couple other lawyers from around the world. And we're aiming to help make legal academia more effective in tackling the world's most pressing problems by promoting scholars and scholarship that again aim to tackle the world's most pressing problems. Here's some of my contact information if you're interested. Again, super happy to talk about the ideas in this presentation over email or otherwise. I definitely encourage you to sign up to the mailing list at legalpriorities.org. We have a summer research fellowship this summer for people interested in doing legal research along these lines, and I think likely we'll have one again next summer. And if doing this type of work in an academic capacity sounds interesting to you, I would definitely encourage you to apply for that. or look at our job postings as well when those come up, because we would love to see some very talented people in those roles. With that, I'm happy to open it up to questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Cullen. That was
Thanks,
really
Andy.
terrific. So I have a few questions to kick it off, and I suppose unless you have a contrary thought, maybe we could triage questions using the Zoom
that sounds
raise
great.
hand function. So if you go to participant list, if you're an attendee with a question, feel free to put up your hand and we can triage it from there. But while we're waiting for people to come up with their questions, I just wanted to ask you at a more sort of personal level, why out of all those options you shared, you picked the path you picked?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely don't think that my path is like necessarily the most effective one, or one that makes sense for everyone. I think I got very lucky in some ways that the effective altruism community was really trying to build up AI governance as a priority pathway for people in effective altruism. I mean, yeah, so the reasons I got involved in that were largely like path dependent, in the sense that people were trying to recruit lawyers and policy researchers for AI policy around the time that I was, deciding on a career path. I am very persuaded by the case that AI could be a very important technology for the long run of humanity, that the potential for catastrophic risks from artificial intelligence is sufficiently high that we ought to dedicate a large amount of resources to preventing that. And working, part of the reason that I continue to do that is just I ended up being able to contribute well to that field after trying it my 2L summer. So those are kind of like the main, both like moral and personal reasons that I did that. That said, if you are like not persuaded by some of the philosophical arguments for long-termism, which I'm happy to go into a bit more if people are interested, then obviously then the kind of long run arguments for focusing on the governance of artificial intelligence may not be as persuasive to some other people here.
I guess a second question I have, thank you, that was helpful. A second question I have has to do with something that a lot of people might have heard about when they maybe first heard of effective altruism, which is a career path of earning to give. And for any who might not be familiar, the basic idea is sometimes you can do quite a bit of good by going into a career where you earn a ton of money and then give away a ton of money, which might actually generate a lot more resources for, say, an effective nonprofit to use than had someone else taken your position and not donated that amount of money. So I wonder if you could talk about so that might be, I imagine, a potential career track that might occur to some lawyers, but because quite a few lawyers have quite a big earning potential. So I wonder what your reaction is to the earn to give idea, its role in the effective altruism movement or community, and maybe your personal take on it as a potential viable path.
Yeah, so just to motivate this a little bit, there's a great article from, I think, the Chicago Law Review on like the net present value of a law degree, and they found that it is about $1 million. And I think that a lot of people here, if they won $1 million, like in 1 to 3 years from now, would probably give at least some of that to charity. And that's kind of the position that we're in. Obviously, like we have to work for our law degree, but a law degree enhances your earning potential a ton, and I think it's underappreciated. I know it's probably a bit hard to appreciate right now, given that we're in the midst of a pandemic and a bad job market. But in the long run, lawyers, especially lawyers from HLS, can expect to earn a ton of money if they choose to pursue that path. I didn't highlight that here because I think there are probably more promising avenues to improve the world, like the ones I mentioned here. I even think that it might make sense as a backup option that you're like aiming to go into nonprofit or government work in one of these areas after graduation. But if you can't find a role that seems pretty impactful to you, then going to earn to give might make sense. Even so, I would probably say that working in the government is a better way to start your career and build career capital for altruistic purposes than earning to give, just because so much of the ways that effective altruists want to improve the world have to do with shaping policy and law. And a lot of us, myself included, kind of lack the experience in government to do that most effectively. And so I think spending time in either state or federal government to learn how the bureaucrats think and how the process of making law from a firsthand perspective is really valuable to the pursuit of effective altruism. And so I would definitely encourage people to consider that. I would probably, in most cases, prefer people to do that than earn to give. Although I think earning to give is, again, a fine option if that's what it comes to. A number of our fellow HLS EA graduates are earning to give right now. It looks like we have a question. Should we go to?
Yes.
Go to that.
It looks like Seth Rubenstein.
Hey, Seth.
Hey, Cullen. Thanks a lot for this. This is great. I'm curious. I'm really interested in AI governance myself. Just curious what some of the kind of current projects are that you're working on in that space, and also more broadly, working in a sort of external kind of research-oriented organization, how you think about the work that organizations like that do relative to the work that tech companies and technologists creating it do in terms of both sort of conflicts and collaborations, I guess.
Yeah, great question. So to start with, some of the work that I do on a day-to-day perspective is I do a lot of, I work pretty closely with our general counsel to kind of improve the internal governance and policies within OpenAI, the organization that I work at, which is an AI lab. You probably have heard of us from things like GPT-3. And OpenAI is a very unique organization. We're a limited partnership, and our primary fiduciary duties are to a document called the OpenAI Charter, which kind of lays out OpenAI's ethical and moral principles. And we kind of subordinate fiduciary duties to shareholders below our duty to uphold those values. So a lot of what I do has to do with kind of arranging the internal mechanisms of OpenAI so that they can better live up to the values of the charter. I do a fair amount of work on things like managing political risk, on things like advising governments on policy related to like intellectual property and some other aspects of national security. I spend a decent amount of time thinking, this is like the least legal thing that I do, thinking about what the benefits from the AI technologies that we are aiming to create might be and how those can be distributed equitably. So that's kind of what I do on a day-to-day basis at OpenAI. I'm sorry, it's a little vague because some of it is confidential, but you can think of it as kind of an auxiliary GC role that is kind of more motivated by policy and ethics considerations than maybe the GC role at a typical company would be. So in terms of the second part of your question was like kind of the differences in like different organizations one could work in, right, to advance AI policy. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess directly, sort of to what extent you actually work directly or engage with, tech companies and technologists creating directly creating the AI,
yeah.
And also just more sort of indirectly or broadly how you think about the, I guess the conflicts or areas for collaboration or different approaches that the two take.
Yeah, great. So like I said, OpenAI is a AI company. So we build AI, and that's like the primary way that we aim to benefit the world is by creating beneficial AI. And so we work very closely with the technologists inside of OpenAI to create technically informed policy. Again, this is like a very unique setup. I don't think there's many policy kind of organizations that work this closely with technical people to have their work be technically informed. And obviously, most of the kind of places one might work for AI policy are not as integrated as that. So there is definitely like, you know, we also have like organizational interests that you know, we aim to manage the conflicts of those with our ethical goals. If you're super wary of those, then obviously working in an independent organization could be sensible for you. But being inside of an organization, you really have super high leverage over the way that technology is developed and deployed. And so I think that really gives you a great opportunity to shape the way that AI is used in the world. And you know, my experience in OpenAI as an organization has been really positive in the sense that the recommendations that I make are taken super seriously and often implemented, or at least considered at very high levels. I think that there's a whole ecosystem of AI policy institutions, and where it makes sense for you to work will depend on kind of the areas that you're interested in and your background and other skill sets. So if you're interested in doing kind of like legal engineering type work of like actually implementing ideas into practice, then I think working in an AI institution, an AI lab like OpenAI makes sense. That's the work that interests me the most. If you're interested in the more academic side of things, I would say that working at you know, obviously like having an academic job, working at some place like Berkman Klein or a think tank, an external think tank would make more sense because you have kind of more wiggle room and independence to pursue whatever academic projects interest you. And then there's also a really important kind of government industry interface that again takes like a different skill set, has more to do with thinking about policy implementation, how to change policy, and the role of government in regulating AI. And so I think that those are kind of the three different clusters that one might take. And obviously they overlap and interact to varying degrees, but based on which of those sounds like most interesting to you and also fits best with your skill set and kind of background would determine where I would go.
Terrific, thank you. We actually do have another question from the person whose talk was nested within the talk, like Inception. Jay Schuster would like to ask something.
Thanks, and I'm sorry I showed up late and kind of snuck in, and so forgive me if this was already addressed in some way, but I know actually that a fair number of EAs, myself included, care deeply about animals, obviously, but also are really interested in issues of artificial intelligence and actually are interested in the intersection between these two issues, and are concerned about whether the interests of animals and animal-like minds are being sufficiently factored into very smart folks thinking who are working on AI ethics issues. And I know actually a lot of EA lawyers like myself that are wondering what opportunities, if any, right now are available for folks that want to work on that kind of intersection. And yeah, if you wanted to speak to that, those potential tensions more generally, I would be very interested to hearing any thoughts you had to share about that.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I didn't mention this at all, but I think it's a super interesting area that lawyers ought to be thinking pretty hard about. I did mention the Non-Human Rights Project. I don't know if you were there for that part, but work like that, considering kind of the forefront of the intersection between moral status and legal personhood, definitely continues to interest me. To motivate Jay's question a little bit more, it seems possible, at least, you know, this is obviously a huge philosophical question, whether AI could ever become sentient, whether sufficiently advanced AI could become sentient. I guess to me, I don't see a great argument for thinking that it couldn't, and that makes me at least worry that we could either inadvertently or intentionally create digital minds that are capable of suffering. And obviously, we as a society don't want to be in the position of creating kind of like enslaved digital minds, or at least digital minds that are in very poor, have very poor welfare. This is a question that I think like the moral questions are less tricky than the legal ones. How one would come up with like legal criteria for deciding which digital minds are considered persons seems super complicated to me. If you have like a cognitive science background or neuroscience background or something, I think that would be like an amazing use of your talent, is to come up with like some sort of legal test, or at least like legal criteria that one ought to consider when deciding whether to grant some kind of legal or moral consideration to digital minds. I imagine there's an organization that I encourage people to look into called the Center for Long-Term Risk, which I think probably does the most thinking about this in the EA community. And I would hope that they would be open to people going there to research this kind of intersection between protection of digital minds and law. I think I have very poor ideas about how to tackle this question, because it seems really hard. The architectures of state-of-the-art machine learning look very little like the minds that we're familiar with, and so it's just very unclear to me what like whether they're sentient or at what degree they would be sentient, and if they are, what their welfare would entail. I encourage people to look up the writings of Brian Tomasic, who is kind of one of the leading, or at least like one of the early thinkers on this problem. He and maybe Andy or Jay could link Reducing Suffering in the chat. Yeah, he has just like a ton of writings on reducing-suffering.org, I think, on this question. But yeah, thinking about this, I think, is super important. And I have, it's one of those areas of law that's like mostly greenfield, like pretty open. And so if you want to be one of the leading thinkers on the moral status of artificial intelligence, then I think that, you know, people have written kind of preliminary law review articles about it, or have alluded to some of these ideas. But I think that some of the more serious work of like actually proposing frameworks for protecting these interests is pretty open.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
So I just want to clarify, and I think you covered a big portion of the sort of concerns.
Oh, great.
But I'm also interested in not just animal-like minds, but animal minds themselves.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I would just be curious to know, you know, frankly, I'm concerned. I look around and I see a lot of discussion about how to make sure that artificial intelligence, their you know operations are aligned with you know human interests, and that's the language that I see everywhere. And you even have, you know, it's in the name of the organization, Center for Human Aligned Artificial Intelligence, or Future of Humanity Institute. I'm probably getting some of these names wrong, but you get the gist of my question. So I just have a factual question for you right now. That is, to what extent are these various institutions, including OpenAI, to the extent you can talk about it, already considering the impacts of this technology on animals themselves? And would you like to see more explicit factoring in of animals' interests into the thinking?
Yeah, I would definitely like to see more. I think that, you know, as I mentioned, part of my job at OpenAI is thinking about like what the benefits from artificial intelligence might be. And so I try to very explicitly include non-human animals in that calculus. I think there's a really interesting political philosophy question, which is like, to what extent would an actor with very powerful AI be legitimate in kind of ignoring democratic considerations in allocating resources for the benefit of non-human animals? One of the nice things about OpenAI, in addition, is that a lot of the staff is from the EA community, and so has a lot of inherent concern for these questions. I definitely think, though, that like for, you know, I think it's dangerous to be in a world in which we rely on like the good graces of AI companies to take these concerns seriously. Again, the reason that I do work at OpenAI is that I think overall it's an extremely well-aligned organization, and I would be pretty optimistic that they would take actions that are beneficial, not just for humans, but for non-human animals in the long run. I think that there's a reality, which is that like we're accountable in certain ways to democratic forces. And unfortunately, those democratic forces don't well represent or protect the interests of animals. And so I think that there needs to be some kind of backstop in the form of reforming the way our overall society and democracy thinks about non-human animals. And also, obviously, that's more important the less confident you are that the organizations that end up developing kind of the most powerful AI systems are thinking about animal welfare.
I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. As Cullen mentioned, this is an area of strong interest for me too. So Cullen and I might want to connect offline sometime about this question. I love it. This is terrific.
Yeah. I would also say that like if people are interested in this like political philosophy question, which has like some legal flavors, it's obviously something that comes up often in like the role of courts, right? It's like when is judicial review appropriate? It's kind of a similar philosophical question to the extent to which organizations that aim to be serving humanity as a whole can also consider the interests of non-human animals without kind of fundamentally revising that commitment, or at least without having some sort of democratic ratification of that commitment.
There has actually been some political philosophy scholarship on this question as it relates to animals, where basically the argument is calling into question whether the laws that apply to animals have any democratic legitimacy at all.
Yeah. I think unfortunately, like the democracy kind of ceases to be the right framework or something, or at least like you want to do something else probably at that point. But yeah, I think part of what kind of even people who aren't involved in AI policy can do to be effective here is just like really make a strong case that there are like grounds of legitimacy other than democracy, especially when we're thinking about entities that aren't democratically represented, like non-human animals, and kind of making that a part of your worldview and kind of political advocacy or political identity seems quite important to me. Like really pushing people that like it's okay to act non-democratically on these bases, like protecting animals seems important.
Yeah, I think the argument is basically like judges, this is an area where judges should be willing to divert from kind of majority opinion, because the true majority's interests are not actually being represented in the process.
Right.
We have a hand up from Adam Lerner.
Hey, Adam.
Hey, Cullen, thanks a lot for this. This was super inspiring. And I had a very practical question for you.
Great.
Which is, suppose you want to leave your options open, because there are lots of things that you can do with a JD that are in line with effective altruism's goals. What do you do on day one? What do you do before you have the JD to set yourself up so that you're in a good position to go into whatever organization you're able to go into to promote these goals? Should you be specializing from the get-go, or should you be doing certain clerkships? I don't know. Like, this is a naive question. What should you be doing in law school before you have the JD in order to set yourself up to promote these goals once you have the JD?
That's a super great question. It also relates to a talk that I'm actually going to give this weekend. Andy, could you find the link for the EA Student Summit and put it in the chat?
Gladly.
The registration is closed, but I've been told that they will accept late registrations from this event if people are interested in this. So in that talk, I kind of recommend for your course selection to do a pretty bifurcated approach. So I recommend that you do at least half, and maybe even closer to like 60% of your kind of 2L or of your like elective courses as pretty standard law stuff. So things like admin and like con law, evidence, things that would just like make you a generally competent lawyer. Even though I don't like really practice right now, I'm like always super glad that I did that, and it was both like the right decision ex ante, but it also just often comes up in kind of weird and unpredictable ways. And so that just like obviously preserves the option for you to just go into private practice during your first few years while you kind of plan for a longer trajectory to make an impact. And again, earning to give or going into government work just seem like pretty decent like first steps for people who can't get into the cause area that seems most promising to them right after law school. I think I got very lucky in being able to do that right out of law school. And definitely like, definitely like, I'm glad though that I spent a lot of time taking kind of more bread and butter law courses. I would definitely like make sure at least one of your summers is at a like more traditional legal job. I think it's, I took a big risk my 2L summer by going to an academic institution, the Future of Humanity Institute, instead of going to a firm. I did go to the ACLU my first summer where I had a good like practice experience. So I did do that. I kind of supplemented that by doing a clinic. So I think if you want to do something like more risky and do kind of a non-traditional summer, then some like preserving your career options by like doing a clinic to build up practice experience is probably a good idea. Clerkships are obviously like a pretty good experience in general. They definitely like run your career horizons in certain ways. I didn't do a clerkship, so I can't really speak well to whether it's worth it. I would guess that you can probably just gain most of the benefits just by practicing an additional year and not doing a clerkship, unless you have like a very specific route in mind that a clerkship would make sense for. I didn't really explore that option too well, so I guess I don't know a ton about that. Yeah, so for I would basically, again, pursue a bifurcated path, build up your skills as like a general, competent like general lawyer or whatever kind of specialty you can have like a fallback option in, but then allocate the rest of it to kind of your main bet for like improving the world in the long term. For me, that was stuff related to artificial intelligence. For other people, it might be biotechnology or animal law or something like that. And then also just like be open to a longer career, like a longer run career trajectory. So spending some time doing things like earning to give while also learning a particular area of law in a law firm or going into government. I wouldn't be too worried that like your first like 1 to 5 years out of law school aren't the most impactful if you're building up super valuable experience, both like improving your skills as a lawyer, really learning an area of law, and understanding how these like institutions or areas of practice work. There's like a ton of times that I wish I had more practice experience, that I wish I knew like how the government worked much better than I do. Like for all the, all the like admin law in the world, like won't teach you how like, agencies actually think inside about like promulgating a regulation, like what that looks like from the inside. That's something I kind of think you have to spend time in DC to really learn. And so that type of experience will be valuable in the long term. There's also like things that I think from an effective altruism perspective, like we would need people who have had a longer experience in practice to actually do things like setting up kind of unique charities or setting up kind of like weird financial arrangements that effective altruists are kind of interested in. So like there's an idea in the effective altruism community about saving to give on like the scale of like thousands or hundreds of years potentially. That's like a kind of a weird charity law question that I don't really like. I would need a lot of experience in like charity and tax law to really understand well. So building up experience in those areas could position you well to tackle these questions, these weirder questions that come up later.
That's super helpful. Thanks. Yeah, I was going to ask, is there a case to be made for going into practice for a little while before going and doing something more EA specific? But yeah, that sounds like there is some reason to do that.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Jay, do you have thoughts on that as the person here who spent the most time in private practice?
I'm so sorry. The fact that I'm in private practice has meant I've been doing something else while that question was asked.
No worries. What are the, I guess like, what are the like kind of, what's the kind of option value of like going into private practice, even if it's not in kind of like a top cause area early in your career?
I mean, I just think it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason that it's you can always go from law to policy, but you can't go from policy to law.
Right.
And I mean, if you get a job at a not even necessarily top tier firm, but like even like a top 100 law firm and do big law, I mean, I think you can kind of pivot to do whatever you want. It's just the question is, will you be able to find enough free time to work on that paper that kind of helps you, or go to that conference that helps you get your foot in the door to this other policy world? But I think everybody is happy to see that you've got years of experience working at a big law firm because it just demonstrates your general competence and professionalism. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of option value. It's really just the major opportunity cost of the actual time you spend doing it versus the other things you could be doing. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I would definitely second that. Like, it would be very hard for me, like almost impossible for me to like actually like pivot into private practice on like a world-class stage right now, just given the fact that I'm not doing that right now. So definitely like the option value of that is pretty high.
That's super helpful. Thanks,
You
both
can
of
see
you.
there are plenty of, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to quickly say we can see there are plenty of EA lawyers that have totally left their
Yes.
fancy jobs and are working at the highest levels in the policy world.
I think we have time for one more question, and I see Mackenzie's hand, so please.
Yeah, thanks for making time to talk with us, Cullen. This has been really helpful.
Great.
Going back to Jay's question a little bit, maybe even prior to someone going into private practice, say you're in law school and trying to make a pivot towards a more effective field and maybe don't have the background leading up to it, what recommendations would you have for kind of like early stage projects? I know people always recommend, writing a blog post or working on something, smaller to get your feet wet. But is there anything you can kind of think of those initial projects to put yourself out there, see whether you like the work? And if you can think of any specific groups that you find exciting or projects that, come to mind off of the topics from today, that would be even better. But I know that's a little bit harder.
Yeah, so just to be clear, are these, are you thinking of like after law school and like time as like a first year associate, or like during 3L?
Both. And so this question is pretty, like relevant to myself going into spring semester. So either.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, I think familiarizing yourself with the field obviously is important. So doing a lot of reading and then figuring out a way to like demonstrate that you have familiarity with the field. So like one of the things that I did pretty intentionally with some of the like electives that I took that were like paper classes, seminars rather than exam classes, was like to just like write those papers on things that I cared about relevant to effective altruism. So like, for example, I wrote like, I did a cost benefit analysis seminar and wrote my paper on like cost benefit analysis problems for like long run impacts. So I think that that's like a good way to number one, produce like a product that you could, show to people that like kind of demonstrates the fact that you've like learned about this and thought about this at a decently high level. It also like gives you an excuse to spend class time like learning about the thing. I guess like if you end up going into private practice, obviously like pro bono is like a nice way to kind of stretch outside your comfort area. I think a thing that I think is a problem in the kind of effective altruism and law intersection is that like there's just like a market mismatch between the demand for legal services and the availability of them. So like there's a lot of EA organizations that, or like EA individuals that could use legal services in some way, but just due to the like just due to a number of things like information barriers and obviously like the restrictions on like jurisdictional restrictions, it's potentially hard to serve them. So like remedying that could be a good way to stay involved in the community while doing private practice. So doing that through pro bono stuff. I mean, I think there's also like a number of areas that there are actually interesting like private practice opportunities in that you could like be on the cutting edge of, potentially building career capital for longer run pivots. So things like patent law, for example, are like super relevant to biotechnology stuff. So like becoming like a biotech patent person, if that was like something that was available to you, seems like a good way to build up career capital while maintaining the option to like pivot later. And I think that for organizations interested in like biotech policy, that background would be pretty valuable. Similarly, like environmental, there's actually like, from my understanding, again, I don't have a ton of experience in big law, but like a lot of big firms do environmental work of various sorts. It's obviously more on the like compliance and potentially defense side, but like learning how that goes is potentially important and like could be used to pivot later. I guess like you obviously have to thread the needle of not wanting to like build up a reputation as someone who's like working for big evil corporations or something. But like one of the things that I strongly considered doing when I was thinking about working in climate policy for EA reasons was thinking about doing like green energy, like transactional and project finance stuff as just like a bridge between like private practice and then working in policy or nonprofit work. So I would look for kind of like practice areas that have that sort of bridge aspect where you'll be able to like dedicate resources to learning and even like positively contributing to the area that ultimately interests you. And for some of these kind of like emerging technology questions, I think there actually are a decent amount. And also for like anything having to do with policy, obviously big law firms like interface with government policy in different capacities. So thinking about like admin law or stuff like that could make sense as well.
That's terrific. I see we're at time, but I just want to thank Cullen one more time